The conference room air tasted of expensive cologne and stagnant air conditioning. Grant sat at the head of the mahogany table, chin lifted like a conquering king. He gestured toward the map of the coast. "All 11 Florida rentals are mine," my brother declared at the inheritance meeting. "Maria gets nothing." My mother and Aunt Diane cheered as if he had just won a war. I leaned back and smiled. "Dad, you really don't know, do you?" He froze. My brother screamed, "Know what?" I didn't answer him immediately. Instead, I traced the edge of a plastic folder resting in my lap. The silence stretched until the humming of the overhead lights felt like a physical weight. My father's hand began to shake, his wedding ring clicking rhythmically against the table. He looked at Grant, and then back at me with wide, hollow eyes. He was searching for a lie, but found only my terrifyingly calm expression. Grant's face shifted from triumph to a panicked, blotchy red. Grant stood up so quickly, his heavy leather chair slammed into the drywall. He demanded to see the original will, his voice cracking like dry wood. I didn't reach for the will. I unlocked my phone and tapped the screen to project a live feed onto the wall. The county property database flickered to life in the darkened room. I started typing the first address in Tampa. The cursor blinked with a rhythmic, mocking heartbeat. Every eye in the room was pinned to the white light. The search results snapped into view with brutal clarity. Under the heading of legal owner, my name appeared in bold black letters. I scrolled to the next property in Orlando, and then the beach house in Miami. My name repeated 11 times like a steady drumbeat. Mom gasped, her hand flying to her throat as if she were choking. Grant reached for the projector, trying to block the light with his palms. He looked like a man trying to stop a flood. "You managed the properties, Grant, but you never actually looked at the deeds." I slid a thick binder across the table. It contained 5 years of bank statements and forensic audits. While he bragged about repairs and collected cash rents, I documented every cent he funneled into his personal accounts. My father slumped in his chair, suddenly looking a decade older. He realized his favorite son had been stealing from the family legacy for years. Grant's knees finally gave out and he sat. I stood up and smoothed my skirt, feeling the cold weight of the keys in my pocket. "The police are waiting in the lobby for the binder," I said quietly. Family loyalty was a luxury they used to keep me small, but the law only cares about signatures and stamps. I walked toward the door without looking back at their shocked faces. My heels clicked against the marble floor with a final, decisive rhythm. Behind me, I heard my father finally whisper my name for the first time. The lobby was a cavern of cold marble and echoing silence. 2 detectives stood near the elevators, suits contrasting against the white stone. They didn't look like heroes, they looked like accountants with badges. I handed over the heavy forensic binder without a word. My fingers felt oddly light now. The lead officer flipped through the pages of Grant's theft. He nodded slowly, then checked his watch. The law was moving. Grant's world was officially beginning to burn. I walked toward the parking garage, my breath visible in the chilly morning air. My phone vibrated with a frantic text from my mother. She was begging me to come back inside and talk. She called it a misunderstanding. I deleted the message and kept walking. My car sat in the shadows of the 3rd level. As I reached for the door handle, a shadow moved. Grant was leaning against the concrete pillar. He looked disheveled and desperate. His eyes were bloodshot, and he held a crumpled envelope in his shaking hand. He tried to block my way, his shadow stretching long across the floor. "You think you've won," he hissed. His voice was a jagged edge of its former self. He claimed the deeds were signed under duress. I didn't blink or move away from him. I just stared at the coffee stain on his expensive tie. He was losing his grip on the narrative. Grant shoved the envelope toward my chest, demanding I sign a recantation. He promised to pay back every cent if I just dropped the charges. It was a pathetic offer from a man who had nothing left. I looked at the paper and saw his sloppy, desperate handwriting. He was begging for a mercy he never showed me. I pushed the envelope back and stepped around him. The silence between us was heavier than any of his threats. I started the engine, the low growl filling the empty concrete space. Grant banged on the glass, his face pressed against the window. He was screaming something I couldn't hear over the motor. I backed out slowly, watching him shrink in the rearview mirror. He was a small man in a very large grave. I drove toward the exit, the sunlight blinding as I hit the street. My first stop was the bank. I had accounts to freeze. The teller was polite and efficient as she processed my requests. She didn't know she was dismantling a family empire with a few keystrokes. I watched the balances reset to zero on the small screen. Grant's personal credit cards were tied to the corporate accounts. By noon, he would be unable to buy a sandwich. It was a cold realization of my own power. I felt a strange lack of guilt. I was finally acting like the owner. A notification popped up on my phone as I left the bank. It was an automated alert from the Miami Beach house security system. Someone had just entered the front door, using an old master key. My heart hammered against my ribs. I hadn't changed those locks yet. I checked the camera feed and saw Aunt Diane. She was carrying a cardboard box and a roll of bubble wrap. She wasn't grieving. She was looting the property. I stared at the pixelated screen of my phone. Aunt Diane moved through the Miami living room like a professional thief. She was reaching for the small crystal vase Grandpa Hank had brought from Germany. My objective was clear: stop the hemorrhaging of my inheritance. I swerved into the middle lane, tires protesting against the hot asphalt. The drive to the coast would take hours. I needed a faster way to lock her out of my life. I dialed the local locksmith in Miami while weaving through midday traffic. His voice was raspy and disinterested until I mentioned the emergency fee. I told him to meet me at the property in 10 minutes. He laughed, saying he was already across town on another job. The pressure mounted as I watched. Diane wrapped a second heirloom in silver foil. She was clearing the shelves of everything that carried a memory. My grip on the steering wheel tightened. I pulled over and opened my laptop on the passenger seat. I needed the remote access codes for the smart home system. Grandpa had installed a high-end security suite before his health failed. My fingers flew across the keys, bypassing the user interface Grant had set up. I reached the core admin settings and found a hidden partition. Grandpa had left a voice memo saved in the directory. I clicked play, and his gravelly voice filled the car. "Maria, if you are reading this, the locks are just the beginning." He explained that the entire house was wired with an integrated lockout protocol. It didn't just lock doors, it sealed the hurricane shutters. I felt a surge of cold, calculated power. Grant never knew about the master override. I entered the final command and watched the live feed. A heavy mechanical hum echoed through the Miami house. Diane stopped and looked up at the ceiling. The steel shutters began to descend with a terrifying, rhythmic clatter. Sunlight vanished from the room as the heavy metal slats slid into place. Diane dropped the crystal vase, and it shattered against the tile floor. She ran toward the front door, but the deadbolts engaged with a sharp snap. She was trapped in total darkness. I watched through the night vision camera as she pounded on the reinforced glass. She was screaming, but no one could hear. I realized then that Grandpa had anticipated this exact moment of greed. He hadn't just given me property. He had designed a trap for the vultures. I picked up the phone and called the Miami Police Department. I reported a breaking and entering in progress at my private residence. The dispatcher confirmed a patrol car was only 2 blocks away. I felt no pity for the woman crying on my screen. She had chosen her side years ago. The legal team confirmed Diane would be charged with grand larceny and trespassing. Her attempt to strip the house had failed. The police arrived just as the locksmith pulled into the driveway. They found Diane huddled in the foyer, surrounded by stolen goods. As they led her out in handcuffs, my phone chimed again. It was a call from the estate attorney, Mr. Whitman. His voice was frantic and lacked its usual professional polish. "Maria, you need to come back to the office," he stammered. "Grant just produced a second will. This one is dated 2 days ago. A second will was impossible. Grandpa had been in a semi-coma for a week before he passed." I pulled a U-turn, my tires screaming against the pavement. The objective was to expose this forgery before Grant could leverage it with the bank. My heart hammered a steady, angry rhythm against my ribs. I reached the law office in record time. The receptionist wouldn't even look at me. The air in the building felt thick with a new, dangerous tension. I pushed into the conference room. Grant sat there with a smug, oily grin. He tapped a single sheet of paper with his index finger. It looked official, complete with a blue ink signature and a fresh notary stamp. My father sat beside him, looking confused and hopeful. "This changes everything, Maria," Dad whispered. I didn't look at him. I stared at the signature. It was a perfect copy of Grandpa's looping hand. Too perfect. It lacked his usual tremor. "Mr. Whitman cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. He explained that if the document was valid, it revoked all previous deeds. Grant leaned forward, his eyes bright with a predatory light. "You thought you were so smart," he sneered. He was back in his element, playing the victimized heir. I took a deep breath and stepped closer to the table. I didn't reach for the paper. I pulled a small ultraviolet light from my handbag instead. Grandpa was a paranoid man who loved hidden layers. He had warned me about Grant's ability to mimic handwriting. He told me he had started using a specific security ink for his most important documents. I clicked the light on and swept it over the signature. The room went silent as the purple glow hit the page. Nothing happened. The signature remained a dull, flat black. It should have fluoresced a bright, neon green. My pulse finally slowed down. The silence in the room was absolute. Grant's grin faltered as he watched me scan the rest of the page. "Where is the mark, Maria?" Whitman asked. I explained the security measures Grandpa had described in his final letters. I turned the light toward the original deeds I had brought in my folder. Under the UV beam, his signature on the real documents glowed like a radioactive ghost. The forgery on the table was exposed as a cheap, flat imitation. Grant lunged across the table to grab the fake will. I was faster. I pinned the paper down with the heel of my hand. "This is a felony, Grant. You didn't just lie. You committed bank fraud." My father put his head in his hands and started to sob. He finally saw the monster he had raised. The attorney picked up the phone to call the police for the second time today. Grant looked at the door, but I was blocking it. The detectives arrived within minutes to take the forged document into evidence. They led Grant out in handcuffs while he screamed about betrayal. My mother stood in the hallway, watching her golden boy be hauled away like a common thief. She didn't move to help him this time. I felt a cold, sharp sense of finality settle over me. The battle was won, but the house was still empty. Then, the attorney's assistant ran in with a frantic look. The assistant stood breathless in the doorway, clutching a tablet. "Maria, the bank just flagged a massive wire transfer," she gasped. My objective shifted instantly from victory to preservation. I needed to freeze the estate's liquid capital before Grant's offshore accounts swallowed it whole. I grabbed my bag and shoved past the stunned lawyer. The hallway felt miles long as I raced toward the exit. The high-stakes game had moved from paper deeds to digital theft in seconds. I reached my car and threw it into gear. My phone was already glued to my ear as I dialed the bank's fraud department. The automated voice was a slow, agonizing crawl through digital menace. Every second was $1,000 leaking out of the legacy. I needed a human operator who understood the urgency of a criminal court order. Traffic was a solid wall of steel and red brake lights. I was trapped while the money vanished. I finally reached a supervisor named Sarah. I shouted over the road noise, demanding an immediate freeze on the primary holding account. She hesitated, citing privacy protocols and the need for a secondary signature. My father's name was still on the account as a co-trustee. I needed him to speak, but he was back in the office, paralyzed by grief. The pressure was a physical weight on my chest. Grant had planned this as a final spite. I pulled onto the shoulder and called my father on the second line. "Dad? I need you to be strong for 1 minute," I pleaded. His voice was a broken whisper, but he heard the desperation in mine. I patched him through to the bank's secure line. He verified his identity with a trembling voice and authorized the emergency lockdown. I held my breath, watching the clock on the dashboard. The digital world moved at the speed of light. Sarah came back on the line with a sharp, professional tone. The transfer was stopped with only 3 seconds to spare. She confirmed. I felt my entire body go limp against the seat. The $4 million was safe, locked behind a wall of federal encryption. I thanked her and hung up, staring at the blurred cars rushing by. The physical world was finally catching up to the digital one. But then, a new notification flashed on the screen. It was an alert from the property manager at the Tampa duplex. A group of men was unloading industrial equipment in the driveway. They weren't there for repairs or landscaping. I saw the logo on their yellow vests through the remote camera. It was a demolition crew. My heart skipped a beat as I realized Grant's final move. If he couldn't own the properties, he would ensure no one else could either. He had ordered a teardown. I ignored the speed limit as I raced toward Tampa. My mind was a whirlwind of legal injunctions and emergency calls. The duplex was a historic structure, irreplaceable and vital to my grandfather's memory. I dialed the demolition company, but the line went straight to voicemail. They were already beginning to tear at the porch with a heavy iron claw. I arrived just as the first support beam groaned under the pressure. Grant was likely watching through a remote feed from his holding cell, savoring this final spite. I slammed the brakes as the car skidded onto the gravel driveway. Dust swirled around the yellow excavator like a sulfurous cloud. The machine's metal claw hovered inches from the roofline of the Tampa duplex. I threw my door open and sprinted toward the foreman. My heels sank into the soft Florida dirt. I waved my phone like a white flag. "Stop the work right now." I screamed over the diesel roar. The engine died with a slow, mechanical shudder. The foreman hopped down from the cab, wiping grease on his overalls. He looked at me with bored, squinting eyes. He pulled a crumpled work order from his pocket. "This says Grant Caldwell requested an emergency teardown," he muttered. I snatched the paper and pointed to the owner line. "This property belongs to me, not him." He shrugged and looked back at his crew. They were already stripping the gutters. The pressure in my chest felt like hot lead. I realized I needed a legal shield, not just an argument. I dialed my lawyer and demanded he email the temporary restraining order immediately. The foreman checked his watch, tapping a muddy boot against the concrete. "I have a schedule to keep, lady. If you can't prove you're the boss in 5 minutes, the walls come down." My hands shook as I refreshed my inbox. The sun beat down, turning the humidity into a heavy, suffocating blanket. A black sedan pulled up behind my car, blocking the exit. My father stepped out, looking frail but determined. He held a leather portfolio against his chest. He didn't look at the workers or the machine. He walked straight to the foreman and handed him a single, gold-embossed card. "I am the executor of the primary estate," Arthur Caldwell said firmly. "This work order is a fraud." The foreman's bored expression finally shifted into one of genuine concern. My father turned to me, his eyes wet with a new kind of clarity. He reached into the portfolio and pulled out a set of blueprints. These weren't just for the duplex. They showed a hidden basement level that wasn't on the public records. Grandpa Hank built a vault under this unit, he whispered. Grant wasn't just trying to destroy the house. He was trying to collapse the ground to hide what was buried underneath. The air grew suddenly, unnervingly cold. I took the blueprints and traced the lines with my thumb. The vault was located directly beneath the kitchen floor. I looked at the excavator's claw and realized how close it had come to crushing the slab. The foreman saw the blueprints and whistled low. We can't touch a site with unmapped subterranean structures, he announced. He waved his men back toward the truck. The demolition was over. But a much darker mystery was beginning to surface. The crew packed their gear in a frantic, silent hurry. I stood with my father on the porch, watching them leave. He didn't try to hug me or offer excuses for the past years. He just stared at the kitchen window. Grant knew about the vault, Dad said. He spent every weekend here for a month. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. My brother hadn't just been skimming rent. He was hunting. We walked inside the empty duplex, our footsteps echoing on the hardwood. The kitchen smelled of dust and old citrus. I knelt and began tapping the tiles near the pantry. The sound changed from a dull thud to a hollow ring. I used a screwdriver to pry up the corner of a loose stone. Beneath the ceramic layer was a heavy steel plate. It featured a digital keypad that looked far too modern for the house. I tried Grandpa's birthday and the date of the estate meeting. Each attempt resulted in a red flash and a soft beep. The power was still connected, but the lock was unforgiving. Dad suggested we call a professional, but I saw a smudge on the keys. Someone had been here recently. Grant had the code and the blackened key. He had been inside the vault scavenging for leverage before he was arrested. I looked around the room and saw a small, hidden camera lens. The lens was embedded in the smoke detector, watching us. I realized the feed wasn't going to my security system. It was streaming to a private server. My phone chimed with a new message from an unknown number. It was a video file. I clicked it and saw a pre-recorded clip of Grant. He was smiling at the camera, holding a small, blackened key, recorded before his arrest. "You found the door, Maria," the text read. "But I have the only way out." I stared at the phone screen as Grant's face twisted into a grotesque, pixelated smirk. My objective was to breach that vault before he could trade its secrets for a plea deal. The pressure was a physical weight, a tightening coil in my gut. I looked at the keypad again, its dull plastic keys mocking my ignorance. I needed a sequence of numbers that Grant knew, but I did not. My father watched me, his face a map of regret and growing terror. I grabbed the screwdriver and began prying at the smoke detector housing. The tiny camera lens peered back at me like a glass eye. I ripped the wires out, plunging the remote viewer into darkness. Grant wouldn't be able to watch us anymore. I turned back to the keypad, my mind racing through every family date and significant number. Nothing fit the 6-digit requirement. Then, I remembered Grandpa's old pocket watch. It always ran exactly 4 minutes fast for a specific reason. I entered the numbers corresponding to the time Grandpa always claimed was the true hour. The keypad chirped, and a green light flooded the kitchen floor. The steel plate beneath my feet groaned as a hydraulic system engaged. The floor began to sink, revealing a narrow set of concrete stairs. The floor began to sink, revealing a narrow set of concrete stairs. A gust of stale, recycled air hit my face. It smelled of old paper and ozone. I stepped onto the first ledge, my flashlight cutting through the thick, heavy gloom. The stairs ended in a small, square room lined with steel cabinets. This was the true nerve center of the Caldwell legacy. My flashlight beam landed on a row of black binders, all meticulously labeled in Grandpa's handwriting. They weren't property records or financial statements. They were intelligence files on every local official we had ever worked with. Grant hadn't been looking for money. He was looking for the leverage required to control the entire city. My pulse hammered. I opened the nearest binder and scanned the first few pages. It contained photographs, bank records, and signed confessions from men I saw on the evening news. Grandpa Hank hadn't just been a landlord, he was a silent power broker. He kept the family safe by keeping everyone else's secrets. This was the real reason Grant wanted the rentals. He didn't want the equity. He wanted the throne. I felt a sudden, sharp realization of the danger I now held. The room was silent until I heard a soft, rhythmic clicking behind the cabinets. It sounded like a mechanical timer counting down. I swung the flashlight toward the sound, spotting a small black box wired to the main supports. Grant hadn't just ordered a demolition crew. He had planted a backup plan in case they failed. The timer showed 3 minutes remaining. He intended to bury the evidence and me along with it. My father froze at the bottom stair. I grabbed the most important binder and shoved it into my bag. "We have to go," I shouted, grabbing my father's arm. He was staring at the box, his mouth agape. He couldn't move, his legs anchored by the sheer weight of the betrayal. I pulled him toward the stairs, my boots slipping on the dusty concrete. Every second felt like a heartbeat stolen from a dying man. We scrambled up the narrow passage as the clicking grew louder, more insistent. We reached the kitchen floor just as the hydraulic lift began to rise. I slammed the steel plate shut and dragged my father toward the front door. We burst out onto the porch, the hot Florida air feeling like a blessing. I didn't stop running until we reached the edge of the property. I threw my father behind the engine block of my car. We waited, our breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. The world stayed silent for a heartbeat. The explosion wasn't a roar, it was a muffled, earth-shaking thump. The center of the duplex simply collapsed inward, swallowed by the void of the vault. The center of the duplex simply collapsed inward, swallowed by the void of the vault. A plume of white dust erupted from the windows, coating the hibiscus bushes in a layer of fox snow. The structure was still standing, but the heart had been hollowed out. I looked at my phone and saw a final text from Grant. It was a single word. "Goodbye." He thought I was dead. I stood up and brushed the dust from my shoulders. Feeling a cold, crystalline anger. He had tried to kill his own sister to protect a pile of blackmail. I looked at the binder in my bag and realized I held the keys to the city. Grant was in a cell, but he still had friends on the outside. Those friends were now my problem. My phone rang, and the caller ID showed the chief of police. He wasn't calling to help. I stared at the chief's name on the screen. He was Grant's primary golf partner, and a name I had just seen in the vault's ledger. My objective was to secure the binder before timed. Police sweep erased the evidence. I ignored the call and shoved the book under the passenger seat. My father watched the smoke rise from the duplex with a hollow expression. He finally understood the cost of his silence. I had to move before the sirens arrived. The drive to my attorney's secondary office was a blur of high-speed lane changes. Every black sedan in my rearview mirror looked like a threat. The realization hit me that Grandpa Hank hadn't just left me property. He had left me a target. I reached the quiet suburban office park, just as the sun began to dip. The building was nearly empty, the glass windows reflecting the orange sky. I gripped the binder tight against my ribs. It felt heavier than the millions. Stepped into the lobby and saw Mr. Whitman waiting. He wasn't alone. 2 men in plain clothes stood near the water cooler. They didn't look like lawyers. Whitman's face was pale, and he wouldn't meet my eyes. "Maria, hand over the estate documents for safekeeping," he said. His voice lacked its usual confidence. I realized then that Grant's reach extended further than the jailhouse. The people I trusted were already being squeezed. I stepped back toward the glass door. I pulled out my phone and held it up. "I'm streaming this live to 3 different news desks," I lied. The plainclothes men hesitated, their hands hovering near their belts. I didn't have a stream, but I had the truth. "You can kill me, but the digital copies are already scheduled for release," I stated. It was a gamble. The power balance shifted as they weighed the risk of public exposure. One man stepped back, his eyes darting toward the security cameras. I had a narrow window. I backed out of the office and sprinted toward my car. The engine roared to life, and I tore out of the parking lot. I didn't go home. I drove straight to the one place Grant would never look. I pulled into the gravel lot of a small, ordinary church. I walked inside and found the old priest who had buried Grandpa. He took the binder without asking questions. He knew the weight of a confession. The secrets were finally safe behind a different kind of wall. I sat in the front pew and let the silence wash over me. The lie that I needed my family's approval was finally dead. I was the owner, the protector, and the judge. My phone buzzed one last time. It was a notification that Grant's bail had been denied based on new evidence. I stood up and walked into the cool night air. The keys in my pocket felt light. I drove toward the beach house to change the last remaining locks.